Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Trust me, there's been no collusion, but as an operator, I'm firmly in the camp that believes that effective StratCom is a function of clear policies, processes, and procedures, and that we must always integrate StratCom in the planning process from the very beginning. My personal thoughts after spending the 2003-2013 decade working either in Afghanistan or on Afghanistan is that neither a clear policy or a strategic design ever existed during the entirety of the ISAF campaign. Therefore, StratCom planning could not occur cogently, and we were constantly reactive. Our opponents, on the other hand, were consistently, proactively planning their messaging, and therefore had the information initiative in shaping the perception and therefore the reality of the Afghan people, the people we were there to serve. It's not that they were particularly brilliant, it's just that we weren't particularly effective. So the thrust of my brief remarks today will focus on 6 NATO and ISAF policy, planning, and procedural issues which were either non-existent or flawed during the ISAF mission, and what needs to be done to correct them in the future. It cannot be business as usual or security as usual. First, the international community, to include NATO, never adopted a genuine, I stress genuine, because it's easy to actually talk about things, but actually getting them done properly is another issue. A comprehensive approach, which for the purpose of discussion today, I will define as a means to ensure a coordinated and coherent response by all stakeholders to a specific crisis. Now, why were we not able to do so? Because antiquated mindsets, national politics, and national interest trumped genuine interagency cooperation every time. Institutionalizing a comprehensive approach as a matter of routine in capitals and at the head offices of various multilateral organizations would provide an opportunity for all relevant actors to talk, which is a good start, establish relationships, compare their respective capabilities and capacities. In other words, what will they do, what can they do, and what won't they do? And finally, formulate cooperative working relationships. In crises, a comprehensive approach at the grand strategic level allows for the development of a strategic design, clearly articulating the responsibilities of all actors, broad timelines, and measures of effectiveness. It provides for international community unity of purpose and effort, thereby facilitating coherent and consistent engagement in support of the host government across governance, security, and development, therefore promoting local ownership, something we were very slow to give to the Afghans. To date, NATO still does not have an approved comprehensive approach policy. We need one as a matter of priority as we contemplate options for countering the weaponization of information, as we coined the phrase yesterday, by malign state or non-state actors. My second observation is that the civilian-military integration within NATO peace and crisis headquarters was found wanting. Operations in Afghanistan have demonstrated the need for much greater and more effective civ-mil integration across the spectrum of the international community. Successful crisis management and the prosecution of complex interagency operations require the application of an array of civil and military capabilities that are both deployable and, just as importantly, sustainable over time at all levels. The alliance must be prepared to institutionalize greater civilian expertise in both its peace and crisis establishments, thereby building and sustaining communications and trust between civilian and military leaders and staffs at all levels. Ultimately, civ-mil integration is achieved by changing the way we think, the way we organize, the way we plan, and the way we train. And a comprehensive approach will promote this change in mindset. Which brings me to my third point, changing mindsets. As the Deputy Mil Rep to the Canadian Joint Delegation to NATO in the 2005-2007 timeframe, I witnessed firsthand Cold War mindsets and national agenda dominate both military committee and NAC discussions, compromising the ISAF campaign in its infancy. There was no meaningful, and I stress meaningful, discussion of the comprehensive approach in the NAC. Consensus decision-making by 28 member nations, as well as antiquated NATO sequential processes and convoluted procedures, are time-consuming and not conducive to successfully prosecuting a counterinsurgency for which there still is not, to this date, any agreed NATO policy or doctrine. If we couldn't agree to a counterinsurgency doctrine over an 11-year period of time, which I consider to be a relatively simple issue to address, do we have any confidence that the alliance nations have suddenly developed the political will to tackle the far more complicated information challenges that we discussed yesterday? Another example of dated or flawed NATO policies is the application of the minimum military requirement policy to all statements of requirement for NATO operations. The flawed incremental approach NATO has implemented in Afghanistan in the course of the last decade, where too few resources and capabilities were more often than not delivered too late, clearly points to the need to adopt a more realistic approach, emphasizing what I would suggest is the essential requirements for success, which, if not provided, should result in operations not being initiated. These procedures must change, or NATO will become irrelevant in the current hybrid, asymmetric, indirect, or cyber environment, whatever you want to call it. My fourth observation is that the international community failed to commit to a holistic approach to meaningful, genuine, coherent, and sustainable. And I chose those 5 words carefully because, again, many people went through the motions, but were they actually those things that I just described? The answer is probably not. The single greatest impediment to economic growth and development in any fragile conflict or post-conflict state is lack of human capacity. Afghanistan was no different. And I believe NATO could have done much more to lead the way in this regard from the outset in 2003 when we intervened. Sadly, here again, old thinking, intransigent mindsets, and a failure to really understand the essence of the situation prevailed. The rule of thumb in complex and dangerous theaters such as Afghanistan should be, is it important? If the answer is yes, then the next question should be, is anybody doing anything about it? If the answer is no, or yes, but badly, then the default response should be, then we'll do it until someone else better qualified can do so. The reality is that outside Kabul, for the most part, only ISAF and a few NGOs were there to maintain a proactive presence in the provinces and districts of the country. The UN had regional offices, but for the most part, they were confined to their compounds. ISAF also had the organizational capacity and resources far in excess of all others in theater. PRTs in particular should have played a much more proactive and coordinated international community lead in building the human and institutional governance capacity of provincial and district councils. Engaging early in capacity building would not only have facilitated eventual transition, which for many nations was a thing they were clinging to for their exit strategy, but also it would have thwarted the Taliban's strategic main effort, which has been, all along, to undermine governance and dislocate the legitimacy of the government at all levels. My penultimate point is that NATO ISAF did little to invest in Afghanistan, content rather to merely invest on Afghanistan. Economic development is the catalyst for longer-term peace and security in any conflict, post-conflict, fragile, or failing state. In future engagements, NATO should seek to maximize the positive economic impact of its presence in the theater of operations by adapting existing legacy, and I stress legacy, contracting regulations and emphasizing local procurement and hiring. Finally, NATO has done very little to promote and facilitate political reconciliation in Afghanistan. Operations in fragile conflict and post-conflict states have a political end state. They always do. Political reconciliation is the key to bringing an end to any conflict, and clearly the earlier, the better. The Taliban approached Hamid Karzai in 2002 when the insurgents were weak, with a view to bringing an end to the fighting. The US discouraged him from doing so, and I can understand the reasons why so close after 9/11 there were issues that they were trying to sort out. But in a part of the world where the more enemy you kill, the faster you lose, and in the face of a limitless supply of Taliban recruits, as early as 2004, Hamid Karzai understood that the military victory in the conventional sense, in other words, trying to kill our way out of the conflict, was not possible, and advocated talking to the Taliban. We should have been far more proactive and insistent, NATO, in promoting an Afghan-owned reconciliation and reintegration process from 2003 onwards, very much in a supporting, facilitating role, not dictating or imposing artificial international community timelines to a process which must be event-driven. I would like to conclude with the prophetic words of Robert Zurlich, which you saw on my first slide. It really cannot be security as usual or development as usual, but rather a framework for securing development, bringing security and development together, first to smooth transition from conflict to peace, and then to embed stability so that development can take hold over a decade and beyond. And so given the aforementioned flawed and dated NATO policies, processes, and procedures, I think it was inevitable that NATO ISAF StratCom in Afghanistan would be suboptimal. Now, for the majority of you who are strategic communications, public affairs professionals, and I gather this is the majority of you here, you will be relieved that I do not recommend we shoot the messenger. Perhaps you want to shoot me instead. We need to address the cause. The problem is of a political nature, and it lies in capitals and with the perm reps at NATO headquarters, Brussels. NATO member nations need to change their mindsets in regards to traditional security, governance, and development responsibilities, as well as effectively address how to preempt, dislocate, and disrupt weaponization of information. Furthermore, NATO headquarters needs to undergo a fundamental transformation, something which it has not done, essentially, structurally, policy-wise, and procedurally. We need a more agile headquarters which optimizes simultaneity based on 21st century policy and doctrinal underpinnings. If not, we will be left behind by those who would do us harm and will increasingly, as I've mentioned before, become irrelevant. Thank you.